It's one of the NFL's age-old questions, preparation versus injury risk. How should the Jets handle it? Let's discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out. It helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Our first question, John, how long do you think the Jets should play the starters in the preseason? It seems like the risk of injury is not worth putting them on the field. And that's a great question. It's a endless debate in the NFL this time of year. Once the preseason games get underway, we're getting close to the start of the preseason for the New York Jets in 2024. And I kind of am a contrarian on this because I think a lot of people have the mindset that the questioner does, that it's too much of a risk to put your starters on the field. Now, it is a risk. And I think many coaches in the NFL are risk averse. I think that, if you have your starters on the field too long and somebody gets injured, you get criticized for it. I remember back in 2019, Jets had a linebacker, Avery Williamson, who got injured in a preseason game, and everybody was all over Adam Gase for it, in part because Gase extended Williamson longer than the rest of the starters. It was really the second team defense that was on the field in this preseason game against the Falcons, and he kept Williamson on with the second team, and Williamson got injured, suffered a season-ending injury. Everybody crushed Gase over it. It may have been one of the few moments where I felt like Adam Gase was being unduly criticized because I didn't think it was really Gase's fault. I understand the arguments against playing your starters, but I think people kind of get tunnel vision on things like this. I think there's also a risk for your team not being fully prepared to start the season. If you look across the league, week 1, week 2, guys are not really in game shape. Now, they're in fantastic condition. They're in much better condition than you or I. Maybe not you. I don't know what condition my listeners are in, but I'd imagine you're not in condition. I'd imagine you're not in the same shape as NFL players. But there's a difference between being in good shape and being ready to play in an NFL game. That means, you're used to taking hits. It means that, you're used to the physicality for 60 minutes. And you look at the early stages of the NFL season, and teams just are not ready. You see guys kind of cramping up, late in games. You see guys kind of wearing down over the course of games. It takes a couple of weeks for them to get going. And in this day and age, because of what the players have negotiated with the owners, you don't have the same rigor that you used to have in training camp. In the old days of training camp, I'm not sure preseason games would be super essential for getting ready for the season because there was so much hitting going on. There were so many opportunities. Back in those days, back 15 years ago, teams were actually practicing twice a day. They had what were known as two-a-days. You had a morning practice and an afternoon practice. So it was great for the fans who went to training camp. It wasn't so great for the players. It was very, very physical, very draining. So the players negotiated this with the owners. One of the things the players asked when they signed what's known as the collective bargaining agreement, let's get rid of the two-a-days. In addition to that, they also greatly reduced the intensity of practices. Padded practices today don't happen all that often where the players are wearing the pads. And even then, it doesn't have the same intensity. It doesn't come close to simulating the intensity of game situations the way it used to in the past. In the past, you could kind of get a sense of how a guy would respond to the game. You got a sense that players were in game shape. They were ready to play in the NFL because they had taken hit after hit after hit after hit. If anything, in the past, these camp practices were probably too grueling because guys were exhausted, and there were teams that near the end of the season kind of wore down, especially if their coaches were more intense in the training camp practices because they just took too much out of their teams in August. In this day and age, I think there is a benefit to playing the starters in preseason. Now, I don't think the Jets will. I think if we see Aaron Rodgers at all, it will be something very similar to what we saw a year ago, where maybe 2 series in the entire preseason across 3 games. It may sit out to. It'll probably be a situation he doesn't play every game. He'll probably play like one of the three, and he'll play very sparingly, maybe a series or two. I don't know if Aaron Rodgers needs preseason, but I think a lot of guys do, and I think while Rodgers himself will play very effectively, there would be a benefit to just getting playing with his receivers, just getting a little working on the chemistry with the receivers, how receivers are going to cut in a given situation, how they're going to run certain routes. And then on top of that, beyond Rodgers, just the rest of the guys, just getting yourself into game condition. I don't think, you should play the starters the full preseason. I think that, you also have to consider the back of the roster spots. When you're talking about finding the last guys who are going to make the roster, preseason games are pretty important for many of the same reasons that I just mentioned. Is that it's more difficult to evaluate sleeper players. It's more difficult to evaluate who wins the 50th, 51st, 52nd, 53rd spot on your roster because practices aren't intense. So game situations are a good chance for players to differentiate themselves at the back of the roster. Beyond that, you're finding the balance. I wouldn't want to play my starters the entire preseason because of the injury risk. Again, it's finding the balance. How do we maximize the players being in game shape while minimizing their potential to get injured? So I think there's a balance to be found. I think in general, the league goes too far to the extreme of protecting the players. And I think that works to the detriment of many teams when we're talking week 1, week 2 of the season. And I feel like that it's one of those like hidden advantages that's out there waiting for some team to scoop up. Play your starters a little bit deeper into the preseason games, and they'll be ready to go week 1. And maybe steal a game or two early in the season while the rest of the league, because your players are in game shape, while the rest of the players are trying to work themselves into game shape. I mean, that's kind of my view on this. I think that I think it'll take some coach, kind of bucking conventional wisdom for any of this to change. And look, I think it's a relatively minor thing. I think there is something to be said for preserving your players. I understand the counter to the argument, but I don't think it has to be all one or all the other. I don't think it's a case where you have to choose between playing your starters the entire preseason versus not playing them at all. I think that there's a happy medium to be found somewhere. And I'm not sure many teams have found it at this point. I think a lot of teams are very focused on risk aversion. In their view, the biggest risk is losing your starters, and not just losing your starters, getting criticized for playing your starters too long in preseason. That's just the way most NFL coaches are. They're more afraid of being criticized than anything else. So I would play the starters longer. I think it would be beneficial to the Jets, but I don't think they will. Do I think it's really going to make that big of a difference? Once we get past week 1, week 2, no. I think it can make a difference the first couple weeks of the season, and I think that. But I guess my opinion won't matter. There's what I think the Jets should do, and there's what the Jets will do, and those two things frequently are at odds with each other. So if you're worried about what I've just said, if you disagree with what I just said, you can rest assured that the Jets will not follow what I said. The Jets will go in a different direction. I have very little doubt of that. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the core members of the Jets. Everybody knows Sauce Gardner is part of the core. Everybody knows Garrett Wilson is part of the core. There are a couple of guys out there who you could go one way or another on. We'll talk about who they are continuing here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace in Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down to the closer it gets to first pitch. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. It's not just baseball. Of course, if you're a Yankees or Mets fan, Gametime's a great place to go. Maybe an hour before the game, you decide I want to go out to the ballpark. Well, just check out Gametime. Pull out the app. And you'll see amazing deals. You'll get the view from your seat with a picture so that there's no surprises when you arrive at the stadium, but you can go to other sports, concerts, comedy, theater, you name it. Gametime is the place to go. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKDOWNNFL, one word with no space for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. The future core of this team is Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, Jermaine Johnson, Sauce Gardner, and Michael Carter II. Would you also include Elijah Vera Tucker and DJ Reed? Would you try to extend any of them now if they were agreeable to that? Now, if we're talking about the players who we mentioned are definitely part of the core, you can't extend any of those guys except Michael Carter II right now. We're talking Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, Jermaine Johnson, Sauce Gardner, the fantastic draft class of 2022. You're not eligible to sign an extension until after your third season in the NFL. So it'd have to wait till this coming off season. At that point, yes, I would absolutely be interested in extending them. I think the Jets are never proactive in this stuff. This is the time to be proactive. Lock your guys up early. It always costs you more in the long run to wait on these extensions because the cap just keeps going up. So if you wait on an extension longer, you end up paying more in the long run. So I would absolutely be interested in extending these guys as soon as possible. But I think the bigger point to the question is, would I include Elijah Vera Tucker and DJ Reed in the long-term core of the Jets? I think that AVT could be. I think, look, he's got to stay healthy though. And I guess if the question is, would I be good giving AVT a contract extension right now? I don't think that there's any rush for that. I think AVT's got to show he can stay healthy for a full season. Now, I will repeat this over and over, and I hope he proves me right. I am an optimist about AVT's ability to stay on the field this year. I think he's going to have a good season. I think he's going to show that he can. But until he does show that he can, I don't think you can give him a contract extension. Look, the Jets picked up his fifth-year option, which was surprising to me at the time because of the extent to which he's had trouble staying on the field. But it means that he's under contract for 2 more seasons. So I don't think there's any rush, especially when you have a guy under team control for 2 more years, and he's a guy like AVT. Like after this season, the Jets will have Sauce and Jermaine and Breece and Garrett under contract for 2 more years, but they've proven themselves. That's different, and it's a different dynamic than AVT. AVT hasn't shown that he can. AVT's shown he can play. He just hasn't shown he can play and stay on the field at the same time. So I think he's got to do that. As far as Reed goes, if we're talking like immediate future, I guess he could be part of the core, but he's getting older. He's going to turn 28 this season. I don't get the sense his game is particularly built to age gracefully. I think he depends a lot on his quickness, on his his movement skills, and those are things that go. The corners who age better tend to be the guys who lean more on physicality at the line of scrimmage, who depend on their smart positioning. The things that don't go with age. So I think that, would I be open to a short-term extension for DJ? Yes. Would I be open to a market-setting extension? No. It depends on how much money he's seeking. I think, he might have a few more good years left in him. So, I wouldn't necessarily let him walk out the door right now. But I would be a little bit hesitant to extend DJ Reed into his 30s because I have concerns about how DJ is going to hold up over the long run. I think that, he's been an excellent, and I hate to say that because he's been an excellent player for the Jets. I mean, he's been, again, I've said this yesterday, a grand slam of a free agent signing. I don't think you could have made a better free agent signing. I don't think the Jets have made a better free agent signing since the turn of the century. I mean, since the year 2000. I mean, I struggle to come up with a better value signing, a guy who plays at a higher level on a better contract. DJ Reed's been phenomenal. But all players age, all players decline. I'd be open to a short-term extension, maybe a 1 to 2 year extension, keep him here a little bit longer towards the end of his prime. But I don't know that he's part of the team's future. I mean, I don't think he's going to be part of this team, when he's 31 years old. I certainly don't think he'll be a member of the team's core. So I would. It's a long way of saying. I think AVT, is he part of the long-term core? Maybe. Is DJ, probably not, but he's a heck of a player right now. Next question. Lots of bad buzz coming out about Joe Tippmann the last couple of days. Some critical articles in the media, some discussions about whether he's snapping the ball effectively. How worried are you on a scale of 1 to 10? I'm a 1. I think that Tippmann's got to show he can develop. I think you got to see improvement, but we're talking about the stuff that's happened over the last couple of days. I always say this: you got to not put too much into training camp. This is the first time he's playing with Rodgers, so it's always Rodgers is very, very particular what he wants and the guys surround him. Rodgers is the genius who wants everything done exactly precisely his way, and that's one of the things that kind of raises the level of everybody. Rodgers is the kind of guy that challenges everybody to be better. So I'm not saying that in a negative way. It's actually a positive thing. Rodgers, I would imagine, is much more precise where he wants the ball when he takes the snap than Zach Wilson. I know Tippmann's had a couple shaky shotgun snaps by some of the reports, but we've seen Tippmann snap the ball. We know Tippmann can snap the ball. He's played center, a long time. So I'm not concerned about his ability to snap the ball. I think that he and Rodgers will get it down. This is part of what training camp is for. Part of what training camp is for is building chemistry. We talk a lot about quarterbacks and receivers, guys Rodgers is throwing the ball to. It's also true of the quarterback center. It's an exchange that's tough. I mean, how many times when a center gets injured in a game do you immediately see the snap while the trainers are attending to the center? How many times does the camera snap to a shot of the backup center and the quarterback working on the snap exchange? They want to get it down because it's difficult to take snaps from a new guy. So I think a lot of this is much ado about nothing. I think a lot of this is stuff that because it's training camp, it gets overblown. I always say this: if you heard stories in October that a guy had a bad practice, would you care? No, but you care in training camp because there are no games to discuss. There's nothing real to discuss right now. As I always say, training camp's a long story. It's a long book. It's worth watching. If the issues continue for a couple of weeks, that would be notable. If the issues continue into preseason, that would be even more notable. But I only really worry about this stuff once we get into games. So I think Tippmann should be fine. I'll put it this way: it's going to take a lot more for me to be worried about Joe Tippmann this year. Now, we're going to turn our attention to players we're not worried about. As we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets, we'll talk about some breakout candidates. Some of our listeners are projecting to have big seasons for the Jets. Will they actually meet those goals? I'll give you some thoughts continuing here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But playoffs have wound down, and now we have fewer games. And the sports aren't sportsing like you or I want them to. But FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up big bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. And of course, the Yankees and Mets are in season. So if you're a New York baseball fan, FanDuel's the place to be. Of course, if you're a baseball fan of some other team, not all Jets fans root for the locals. Some Jets fans root for non-New York baseball teams. FanDuel's the place to be. And as we approach the NFL season, Jets have big expectations this year, but they are underdogs week 1 in San Francisco. Again, FanDuel's the place to be. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question: John, do you foresee big things for Tyler Conklin this season? I feel like with Rodgers back, he's on his way. He's going to have a big year. Give me your thoughts. I think statistically Conklin might be at the same level or lower. And the reason I say that is Conklin had 87 targets last year. So what happened, I think the biggest reason for that is Conklin was used a lot as a check down guy. And I think it's a very similar phenomenon to Breece Hall. I've said the same thing about Breece's receiving stats. Is I wouldn't be surprised if they were either level or went down this year, which is counterintuitive with Rodgers back in the mix. But the reason I think it's very plausible is that these are guys who caught a lot of checkdowns. And the reason they caught a lot of checkdowns, I think, is twofold. One is Zach Wilson was not particularly adept at reading a defense. So if he didn't know what he saw, he would just check it down. The second reason is the Jets beyond Garrett Wilson had nothing at wide receiver last year. So there were many instances where, Garrett was double teams. The quarterback wasn't going to trust the other receiver. The other receiver either wasn't going open or didn't have the trust of the quarterback. So there would be checkdowns. Rodgers does check it down quite a bit. He doesn't throw a ton of interceptions. And the reason for that is if it's not open, he's not going to force it. A lot of quarterbacks will try and fit balls into the tight windows. Rodgers, if he doesn't like what he sees, he's willing to check it down. So I think it's a situation where the efficiency level will go up because Conklin last year, I think it was, between a fifth and a quarter of his catches really didn't help the Jets. They were either catches on third down where, it was a check down where he was stopped short of the sticks, or it was in the second half of games where the Jets were getting blown out. And that's, I looked this up. Conklin was at the higher end at the tight end position of those receptions that really didn't help the team. So I think that while the numbers may look similar or even tick down a little bit, I actually would expect the efficiency levels to go up because he's not going to get all these useless checkdowns on third down. He's not going to catch the ball 3 yards past the line of scrimmage on 3rd and 15 and get tackled 6 yards short of the sticks. I think that even if the counting stats are similar or go down, you're gonna have less empty calories. You're gonna have when he gets the ball, it's gonna be more efficient. And Conklin, what does he bring to the table? He's a check down guy he can catch the check down pass. He'll also add the occasional contested catch, down the field. So I think Rodgers might utilize that a little bit. Maybe he'll have a few more contested catches, a few more of those like highlight reel catches. Um, I think I don't think Conklin's suddenly going to challenge, Kelsey and Kittle and Andrews and Laporta as like one of the top tight ends in the league. I think he'll probably post a respectable stat line, and he'll be more efficient. And I expect the same thing for Breece Hall. Is that I don't think Breece Hall's about to become a 1,000-yard receiver. I think he'll post numbers that are around the same, but he'll be more efficient when he does. And that certainly stands to reason that could help the Jets out. Next question, John. Loved what Ashton Davis did last year. Do you think he's on his way to a breakout season? Well, it would be great. And listen, it's possible, players can improve over the course of time. We liked what we saw last year out of Ashton Davis, played much better. But I also think that, sometimes players are bad in one role and good in another. And part of good coaching is finding a player's skill set, figuring out what he does well and putting him in those positions, and figuring out what he doesn't do well and keep him away from those positions. I floated this comparison before, but the Jets had a player. If you're a longtime fan, you know him. If you're not a longtime fan, maybe you don't. They had this guy, Eric Smith, who played safety, and in many ways was similar to Davis, played all over the special teams unit. Coaching staff loved him and was a good sub-package guy. He came in and he played like he was a safety, but they kind of dropped him to a linebacker role on third downs under Rex Ryan. Played some huge games for the Jets. In their 2010 playoff run, he played a huge game the wild card weekend in Indianapolis, then had a big tackle in the divisional round on a fake punt in the Jets upset win in New England. He was a great situational player, great backup, great rotational guy. You put him in, in the nickel or dime, and he played really well. Then in 2011, the Jets extended him, and they gave him a bigger role, and they made him a regular starting safety. And he really struggled. He was, one of the weakest players on the Jets the year he became a starter. They took Eric Smith from a spot where he was doing things that he could execute effectively, and they put him into a spot where they asked him to do things he couldn't do. Now Davis, last year I think there was a role change. He was more of a part-time player, was more of a role player, played a lot near the line of scrimmage. Sometimes lined up in the slot, sometimes lined up in the box, but most of the time was playing near the line of scrimmage. In the past, Davis has really struggled, and where Davis really struggled was when he was lined up deep. I think when the Jets drafted him, they thought he was a very rangy player, a former hurdler in track and field. They thought he could cover a lot of ground. Well, he didn't do it very efficiently. And he actually, I think, was better close to the line of scrimmage because he could play. His aggressiveness didn't hurt the Jets. His aggressiveness helped the Jets. Davis is a very aggressive player. Well, when you're the last line of defense and you're aggressive and you're overly aggressive, that could be an issue. And that was for Davis. When you're aggressive close to the line of scrimmage, you can make big plays. And even if you miss, there are guys behind you who can help you out, clean things up, make tackles that make the tackle for you when you whiff trying to make a big play. So I'd like to see him get better. Look, that's what he needs to get better. He needs to play less aggressively when he's the last line of defense. And if he does that, maybe he actually has a shot at being a starting safety. But I think that Davis, I don't know that the Jets view Davis as a full-time player because, there was all the talk in the offseason about how they were going to let him go. And then the reason he came back is the market wasn't there for him. I think Ashton Davis was expecting a different market than he got, and the bottom kind of fell out. So, he had to kind of go back to the Jets and take a short-term deal. So we'll see. I'd love to see it. I'm not sure it's necessarily going to happen, though. But if Davis gives you what he gave you last year, I think you got to be pretty happy with that. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out. It helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.